FilthyRobot here, just about to start the breakdown of the Baldur Gate 3 classes, and wanted to remind you all that we do not have complete information for this quite yet. A number of these classes are in the game, but only up to level 5 as part of early access, and a number of these classes are not, or subclasses rather, are not yet in the game at all. So the information I'm going to provide to you guys is a little bit of data mine stuff collected on websites, a little bit of my own D&D knowledge going into this, a little bit of previous subclasses, and a little bit of the information released on the games. What this means is some of these things are going to be a little bit inaccurate. Some things that are reported as an action might be a bonus reaction. Some of the things that happen in normal mechanics of D&D may not apply to the Baldur's Gate 3 game. They may have tweaked these engines a little bit. Where I notice these differences or where I can see them, I'm going to try to highlight them. And when I think these are going to have implications on how the character plays, I'm going to mention that. But just a caveat that not all of this information will be exactly accurate because of the sources that we're drawing from. The Baldur's Gate 3 Barbarian is fairly interesting as class changes go for Baldur's Gate 3. The chassis, the Barbarian chassis, so the way it works in D&D, you have your main class and then you have your subclasses of that. Your subclasses come online depending on the class that you're actually playing, and they're often very transformative. The base Barbarian looks very similar in Baldur's Gate 3 as the base D&D Barbarian, which is to be expected mostly, but they've made plenty of changes in their game, so there's no guarantee that that's always going to be the case. And the chassis that you're working with a Barbarian is essentially a melee brawler, right? Lots of HP, best HP dice in the game, best HP progression in the game, initially able to work with light, medium, or zero armor from the unarmored defense feature, as well as carrying a shield. And starts with the rage ability, which is kind of the class defining barbarian feature, which is a bonus action to enter a rage. Rage is canceled. It lasts for either 10 rounds or until you're incapacitated or until you don't attack an opponent or don't take damage in a round. So as long as you are attacking every round with the Barbarian, you keep the rage up till it times out. And rage generally comes with a number of benefits that are often modified by the subclasses. I think the base features are extra damage on melee attacks. Interestingly, not strength melee attacks, all melee attacks in Baldur's Gate 3, which means the Dex barb gets a little bit better. And Dex is already a very, very powerful stat in 5e, and it's nice to see that option be moved to the Barbarian as well. And then resistance to physical damage and advantage on strength-based ability checks and saves, which means the Barbarian tends to be very good at brawler sort of things like throwing people around, pushing them, knocking them over, grappling them if grappling makes it into the game, this type of thing. Barbarians tend to be bad at things like multiclassing and spellcasting. Rage does not work with either heavy armor or with spellcasting, so you can't rage and spellcast. And most of the Barbarian progression is based on Barbarian levels as opposed to levels as a whole, which means that they are very difficult to multiclass with. You can't splash other classes to get benefits that are from them without basically canceling the core features of Barbarian, at least historically. So what do I want to highlight about these classes? We're going to go through the subclasses, but I thought initially it's very interesting that Dex is supported by Rage, which I don't recall being the case in D&D to begin with. I want to point out again that we don't have all the information, so I think I'll probably keep this to the lower levels to begin with, since most of the subclass information we have is just the first promotion of the subclass, which is level 3. We will expect to see subclass features at 6 and 10 as the Barbarians progress, but currently we have no idea what those are going to be like, so I don't want to speculate on them too much. So the Barb has a number of interesting things. Besides unarmored defense, which basically gives you additional AC based on your Constitution modifier, which means the Barb can be a damage dealer with strength or dex, or a tank or some combination thereof. I mostly play my Barbs as tanks, but that doesn't mean you have to do that, and there's lots of ways to make them into damage dealers. The unarmored defense is probably the best splashable portion of, or multi-classing portion of Barbarians. You can do interesting things with something like Wild Shape if that makes it into the game through Druids, combining it with the benefit of an AC class above and beyond the animal's core AC, which tends to be fairly low through the Barbarian feature. It also allows you to pump Con in a way that's better than it would be normally. Most classes just get the benefit of saving throws and health from Con. The Barbarian can actually make Constitution into a armor class contributing stat, which is really neat too. Reckless attack is a core feature of the Barbarians. It allows them to take attacks at advantage, but enemies attack them for the round at advantage. It's good for a damage dealer, pretty bad for a tank. Things like Danger Sense and later on Feral Instinct are related to initiative and related to how the class behaves at the starts of rounds. So here, Danger Sense is advantage on dex saving throws against trap spells and surfaces, and then later on, this becomes Feral Instinct, which is advantage on initiative rolls. So does a little bit of stuff with the dex attribute, a little bit of stuff with attacking here, and then extra attacks at 5. Oh, and then Barbs get fast movement as well, which is kind of a nice one, which is a little bit more mobility. I think it's one tile of extra mobility, if I recall correctly. Does it even tell me? Yeah, 5 foot, which is one extra tile. So, okay, let's do the subclasses. Let's start with Berserker. So Berserker gives access to Frenzied Rage. Frenzied Rage is just a better version of Rage, essentially, which gives you an extra attack each round as a bonus action. It's a melee attack. Baldur's Gate has added a interesting variant of this called Enraged Throw, which allows you to, based on your strength stat, pick up and throw either items around you, including, I believe, like furniture and terrain items. I don't know how we'll tell which ones are interactable and which ones aren't. Maybe they all are. I don't know. This is going to be interesting to see in the game. And it also, according to the description, includes enemies. So according to this, if you go the Berserker class in Baldur's Gate 3, you can pick up and throw enemies at other enemies, depending on how heavy they are. That's pretty cool. That's something totally unique to the Baldur's Gate system. I have never seen this happen in a actual pen and paper game. Additionally, this effect prones them, which is kind of new. Generally, prone is a contested action that is somewhat, not difficult, but it's somewhat specific to get your characters to be able to prone enemies. Prone is a nice melee damage dealing ability. Once you have proned an enemy, other melee attacks on it have advantage, or attacks directly next to it, basically. This is kind of cool because this means with the combination of Frenzy, which is an extra bonus action, and then the Enraged Throw, you might actually be able to do like a subclass Berserker tank, which is kind of rare because you can keep your rage going while taking the dodge action while using a Frenzy bonus attack. And Enraged Throw is a very interesting kind of enabling ability that will make the rest of your team, especially if they're melee damage dealers, do more damage. Or rather hit more often, which is more damage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of cool to see this, totally different. Really looking forward to seeing what that's like in the engine. Not much else different about the Berserker subclass. Wild Heart's a really interesting one too. This is you get a bonus based on a animal type, and you get, weirdly, the ability to talk to animals. Speak with animals is that spell. That has been a really weak spell by and large in most of my D&D campaigns and most of the D&D flavored games I'm playing, but there's a couple classes already in Baldur's Gate 3 that seem to interact with animals, and judging on their previous stuff, they have storylines based on animal companions or animals that you encounter along that. I'm actually expecting this to have a couple uses in the game and actually be fairly fun as both flavor and a random ability that your Barbarian has. So if you go the Wild Heart spec, I think you're actually going to see some Speak with Animal use in the game, which is kind of cool. And then Bestial Heart is choosing between 5 different animal forms that when you rage, they add additional effects to your rage abilities. And all these effects are fairly interesting. So if we walk through those real quick, there's 5 of them: bear, eagle, elk, tiger, and wolf. Bear gives you resistance to everything when you're raging. So this is going to be super good on tank style barbarians, except for psychic damage. And you get what is currently in the wiki as an action. If this is an action, it's useless. If it's a bonus action, it's actually quite good, which is you can heal while you're bear raging it's not a big heal, but it's a little bit similar to second wind kind of healing, right? So you switch to a tanky form. With this rage, you're resistant to all sorts of damage. So even when you are getting hit, you're taking half damage. That's what resistance does. And you have some self-healing. Pretty standard tanky form. Seems pretty decent. Eagle. Generally, the eagle form of the Barbarian isn't very interesting, but this one is kind of cool. You get a couple things. You get dash as a bonus action, which is decent, but not exceptionally great. Barbarian tends to be fairly mobile already, tends to be frontline, tends to be tanking. So bonus action dash is not generally that useful on the Barbarian who already has accelerated speed, etc. But sometimes it can be okay, especially if you're trying to do a damage dealer, and the Barbarian can sometimes solo enemies with the advantaged attacks and run up to a spellcaster or something. So bonus action sprint isn't the worst. While you're doing that bonus action sprint, enemies have disadvantage on opportunity attacks. So again, it's going to allow for mobility. It's going to allow you to disengage without taking as much damage for doing that and without having to spend the action to actually disengage. And you get a new ability called Dropping Attack, which is brand new. I've never seen this in any D&D version, which is if you are above an enemy, you can jump onto them without taking fall damage, and you do weapon damage and a prone attack from the drop down on them, which is totally weird. So I guess if there's enough 3D terrains, I expect this to be really situational, and I expect the Eagle class of Barbarian to be better as a damage dealer than a tank. But it's kind of some neat abilities that we've never seen on Barbarians before, and it's nice to just have a little bit more flavor to these animal subclass specs, which sometimes don't have that so much. All right, moving on. We've got the Elk subclass. This is, or Elk specialization of the Wild Heart Barbarian subclass, which is when you rage, you get additional movement speed. You get basically one more tile of movement speed, stacking with the Barbarian unarmed movement, or whatever it's called already, or fast movement, or whatever it is. So this is now 2 extra tiles of movement, which is quite a lot. Generally, characters start, if they have no modifiers, a neutral character, so not small, not large, no movement effects, no movement penalties, is about 6 movement tiles. So this is defined as like 5 foot per, which seems to be what the Baldur's Gate is using. So this means we're going from 6 to 8, which is a fairly big improvement in speed for Elk. You also get a charge attack, which is a line knockdown and movement effect that charges you forward and prones enemies while doing, I think it's weapon damage, but maybe it's something slightly less for that, which is kind of interesting as well. Not sure exactly what I'm supposed to do with the Elk class. We don't really need more movement on a Barbarian particularly, and we don't really care that much about this form of knockdown. We have lots of other forms of knockdown, but maybe this just stacks with the Barbarian's other forms of proning people, and we really want this as a like enabler for other melee damage dealers, or perhaps melee damage dealers ourselves. Doesn't seem that exciting to me compared to the other ones so far, but still kind of interesting. The Tiger subclass gives you, when you, again, these are all triggered on rage. When you're raging, you can jump farther, kind of really specific and probably not that useful, but who knows? Maybe there will be terrains where this is good, fighting spiders or birds or some stuff like this, right? You get a point blank AoE ability that can target up to 3 enemies that does half of your weapon damage and applies a bleed. Bleed's a totally new status effect in the game, and it's kind of a cool status effect. It's a small dot, and dots in Baldur's Gate 3 apply at the beginning of the turn, or at least this dot does, which is good. Generally, dots that apply at the end of a turn really benefit enemies and don't really benefit player characters very much, just the way the action economy works out. But dots at the beginning of the turn are pretty good for players and enemies, but also players. But the dot's not very big. It says it's a 2-point dot. It doesn't say anything about scaling that I can see. Perhaps it does scale later on, but a 2-point dot is not a very big dot. But it does give the enemies who are bleeding a disadvantage on Constitution saving throws. Now, in of itself, that doesn't help the Barbarian at all. Nothing the Barbarian does cares about about Constitution saving throws, at least to begin with. But that's a really cool thing for other classes. It's another enabler. If you can, as a tank, run up, hit a bunch of enemies with some debuff that makes them weaker to future spells like Blind or other Constitution saving throw kind of effects, like maybe Stinking Cloud or any of these other roles that require Constitution saves, that actually is pretty powerful and pretty cool ability. And notably, all of these abilities haven't listed a save. So normally prone is a contested action. Normally when you're applying status effects, they're contested actions to some degree. Opponents get to either saving throw, or they get to react with either acrobatics or athletics or something like this to resist the effect of these. So far, none of these abilities list having that. I suspect they will once we get into the game. I can't imagine being able to prone enemies just nonstop with no ability for them to prevent that. But at least as what the information I'm reading right now, none of these seem to be resistible effects, which is pretty powerful. All right. And then the final animal form that you can choose is the Wolf Rage. And this is a little bit tough to get information on this one. It seems to say one of 2 things. Either allies get extra movement per battle. Once per battle, get extra couple, I think it's 1 tile of movement for everybody for the duration of the battle. And allies gain advantage on melee attacks on enemies who are close to the Barbarian, or maybe just advantage on enemies who are close to the Barbarian. Again, this is another form of kind of like tank enabler, where you're in close range with enemies, and your allies are going to be able to do better damage to those enemies because of that. I think this is actually probably the most interesting version of the animal animal forms that I've seen yet for, they're not forms really, they're animal aspects of the Barbarian. this is kind of cool implementation. I'm particularly excited about the Tiger one. If we can figure out some con saves that we could run in the party that might take advantage of this, it seems like a really interesting ability. And the bear seems really, really powerful just as a tank barbarian. All right, final subclass, at least at the launch of the game, is going to be the Wild Magic subclass. This is brand new as far as I'm aware of for barbarians. I've never seen this subclass. I've seen a Wild Magic sorcerer before, which basically is a random. It's a very chaotic subclass that as you take certain actions, you're going to be dice rolling off a random list of impacts. And the same is true for this barbarian. So in addition to the normal barbarian stuff, you get Wild Surge, and these are actually really cool. When you enter a rage, you roll on the Wild Magic table, and the Wild Magic table is this table here. And these effects are really strong. You've got AoE necrotic damage to enemies that gives you temporary HP. You have, I guess you'd want to move before raging, which is kind of weird. But still, if you have this subclass, I guess you'll behave slightly differently. You can gain a teleport for the duration of your rage, a bonus action teleport, which is really strong. You can create an exploding spirit every turn as a bonus action within 30 feet of you, giving you some weird damage dealing AoE effect, which is kind of neat. You can make one of your weapons a force-based weapon that returns to your hand if you throw it or do damage with it. Force is a very difficult to resist damage type in general. This is just basically a damage bonus with a little bit of flexibility in your weapon. You can have basically a Thorns aura. When you take damage, you deal damage back as force damage. You can gain bonus AC, and your allies get bonus AC as well. Another really nice frontline tanking kind of barbarian thing. You can make difficult terrain for enemies, which is another powerful effect, especially combined with the abundance of prone that the barbarian's doing. So things like knocking them over and then they can't reach targets because they're too slow on difficult terrain. And then you can also shoot bolts of light from your chest, doing damage and blinding. All of these are kind of wild. These are very different barbarian behaviors. It's random which of these you're triggering each time, but still kind of a cool idea. Going to be a very chaotic barbarian. You're going to have to be quick on your feet to figure out how to interact best with what random ability you roll from your ability stuff. And then supposedly, this one we seem to have a little bit more information, bolstering magic and unstable backlash at later levels. But these are going to be class features going further down this kind of effects that you can generate by being a Wild Magic barbarian. I think maybe worth noting for me is I don't generally find Barbarian a very interesting class in D&D 5e. It doesn't multi-class well for reasons I've already mentioned. It tends to be a pretty one-dimensional melee damage dealer. It tends to be what barbs are for me, or sometimes a quite one-dimensional melee tank. I like these subclasses. My first take on these subclasses, even with just seeing the level 3 sub feature and not even seeing the future sub features of these subclasses, the barbarians look really kind of cool. That's a lot of different things you can do. It really shakes up the boring barbarian rage auto attack kind of mentality that these barbs have by adding a lot of interesting different abilities, to the point where all 3 of these subclasses actually look quite good to me. Particularly the flexibility of the Wild Heart subclass all looked really cool. So I'm excited to see barbarians in Baldur's Gate 3, which are words I never thought I would utter about barbarians in 5e. But man, these look kind of cool, and they look like they might be fairly decent party enablers if you can build a party that capitalizes on the strengths of the barbarian subclasses available. Which, why not? You can certainly build parties around anything you like. So I'm really excited to see these. So yeah, anyways, let me know what you guys think about the barbarian stuff. Cautiously optimistic about this class.